Straight off the top, I've got to say this is the most disappointing case that I've reviewed in a long time for reasons above the complications I've faced with its fans. Nope, same problem. So I have literally no idea why these fans are not working. That's not to say that it's an awful case, since it's also the best case I've reviewed since my new testing methodology, at least, was put in place some time ago, but it just didn't meet expectations, hence disappointing and not worst. Firstly, if you've not seen this case before, it's a fairly pricey ATX case that includes a couple of 120mm fans. Can you really trust a review from someone who calls these 120mm fans 180mm fans? I'm better than this. Just trust me, give me one more chance. Which can be ARGB if you pay more. You also get an ARGB strip. Yep, there. 2 glass side panels, or steel if you want, with a fancy looking front panel and overall design, and a high power supply unit, low motherboard layout. Now, before getting into the core of the review and many rounds of testing, 12 hours worth of testing, I want to address my expectations. Oh yes, in an ill-advised move, I'm going to go into the things I don't like about this case first, and then we'll do the review. Be warned, if you watch from this point onwards, you're only doing it to yourself, so yeah, skip to the next chapter to avoid all of this. Before getting this case, I saw plenty of images of an awesome looking case, which is a great start. There's no doubt it's a visually interesting case. It's also an expensive one at an MSRP of $150. We're talking the price range of the Phanteks Enthru Pro 2, which is a monster, the Thermaltake Core X71, also a monster, or the Lee & 011 Dynamic, a well-known, well-loved case, which is a bit cheaper at $130 MSRP. Although those Lee & and Phanteks cases don't include fans, like the Fractal Design behemoths in this one, more on them later, the Thermaltake one comes with a few 140s. Anyway, with its looks, its price, and its hype, that's a crucial factor in people buying these kinds of cases anyway. I was expecting a lot, but I'm feeling a little cheated. We'll get into the details in the main body of the review, but the main headline downer for me is the cable management. First and foremost, you'd think with such a big case it would be a dream to build in, but it's not, thanks to the top power supply unit combined with the lower sleds and fan hub or splitter position, the tight clearance to the side panel and the trendy straps, which are nice in isolation but not when they're aligned with these grommets, and those plastic cable management brackets that get in the way more than help to manage cables. There's just so much to whinge about regarding the cable management, and I didn't even end up packing it fully. It feels like a lot of misplaced effort. If they compromised with some of the 174mm of CPU cooler clearance, which is overkill, going into the back, bring that down to a more reasonable 160mm or so, which is covering most of the big air coolers around and gives the backside an extra 14mm, you don't even have to go that far or even lose space for the front 180mm wide fans, since you can press or step the tray to open up the space and vary the space throughout where needed. In this case, it could do with something like the opposite of the Define R5, Meshify 2 Compact, and sort of the Define R6. It seems like Fractal are really good at the opposite of what this case needs. Maybe this is Fractal getting better, since the Define R6 is kind of flat and the Torrent Compact is nearly there. Perhaps they're heading towards a better future. But it's not even that, since the Fractal Design Compact Nano does a much better job of this, doing exactly what I'm asking for out of the Torrent Compact, which is actually not that small. I'm only asking for perfection here, it's not a big ask. No, being serious, I just want someone from Fractal Design at the design team level to build a proposed design out of cardboard, maybe even hardboard, might be a bit awkward, whatever works. Build it to full scale and gain a real understanding of how what they're proposing works. 3D printers is a great option, actually try that.
But AV, you don't know anything about the case design process, and they already do those things.
Do they? I'm not feeling it here. I'd love to be educated on the case design process more, much like I feel Fractal Design's design team should be. Yes, I'm being pithy, but this is a $150 case. Let's get the basics right, like super easy cable management in a big case, before we start getting all flashy. Anyway, that doesn't even cover the sheer amount of plastic around. Another one of my gripes. Layers upon layers upon layers of plastic. I completely understand that it's not practicable to use metal with a robust finish for everything. You probably can't form the top panel as cheaply in metal as you can in plastic. Maybe lose some quality in that. But the finish of the plastic is delicate. You accidentally swipe your screwdriver over the top and you'll never not see the mark it'll leave. I'm fine with plastic being a finishing material. I really liked the Define Mini C's much more robust brushed of aluminium effect plastic panel. Notice I'm sticking within Fractal Design's range here as examples. However, this one looks great in pictures, part of the hype thing that I was really invested into, but it won't stand the test of time unless you're careful around it. You couldn't treat this thing as carelessly as I do, like the top of my LAN Cool 2 mesh, which incidentally has an MSRP nearly half of that of the Torrent Compact. But the Torrent Compact is a looker first and foremost, and deters you from putting anything on top in the first place with its rounded top panel. It does actually double as a Fractal Design fanboy detector. I think it covers it in the manual somewhere. You can sit anyone in front of the case and say, the finish is more fragile than most other cases, and if they say anything like, but you should be more careful around your PC, or it's not supposed to be robust, you've got yourself a Fractal Design fanboy. You get that one for free. Anyway, I'm really getting myself into the weeds here. I've lost almost all my friends, and going any further will probably be hazardous to my health. So let's go back to the start of what is an overall positive review and kick off again with the unboxing. Remember, not a bad case, but there's as much room for improvement as there will be in your wallet after you buy it. On the packaging front, there were some signs of a mildly rough shipping experience. It's always worth documenting this stuff outside of doing a video before an unboxing, but getting inside the box there didn't appear to be any damage transferring through to the case, so all good there. Like the case, this is a fancy looking box, nice presentation. That internal box incidentally contains the brackets to allow the front to accept 120 and 140mm fans. By default, it's got the 180s in there, no support for 120 or 140s. You need those brackets. And it has a graphics card support bracket. Not sure why it needed all this disposable packaging. I'm sure cardboard and paper would work perfectly fine. I'm just a nitpicking little turd today, alright? Anyway, the case is also protected by well-sized polystyrene bookends and a foam bag instead of your typical thin plastic bag. I think they were a little cautious about shipping damage, causing scratches to the not completely delicate but slightly fragile plastic finish, which may have resulted in a lot of spare replacement parts being shipped or maybe returns, which might also explain the red warning document that joins the manual. I haven't noticed this kind of inclusion in any other case I reviewed, at least one as prominent and red. Incidentally, the foam bag seems to really reduce the static buildup as the case is moved around in the bag. No sparks or shocks in sight. Oh yeah, there's more protection for the top panel, you never guess why. Let's do a quick lap around the case. Side panels are glass on both sides, it's a very clean look, and you can get other versions of this case with clear glass or steel panels instead of this dark glass. Nice to see those clear glass options back in fashion. The top panel is completely closed off plastic. We touched on it earlier, enough said there. So moving on to the front, we find the I/O. I really like how the manual covers the front I/O, not just labeling what ports and buttons do what, but also what the ports look like and how they roughly connect and interact with your motherboard. All in all, we've got separate mic and headphone jacks, two USB 3 Type A ports, a Type C port, as well as reset and power buttons. Moving around to the rear reveals a lot of this case's secrets. This is a top power supply unit arrangement that sends the PCI Express slots to the bottom, allowing base fans to be installed and vastly improve airflow and cooling potential. Definitely watch my testing on that later, much to be found here. Speaking of which, the entire rear of the main compartment has as much free area as I've seen in a full chassis. There's loads of holes and they're all very large, encouraging airflow to exit the case as directly and easily as possible. Even the PCI Express slot covers are in on the game, a vast difference to the Lian Lancool 215s, which have lots of very tight holes. The motherboard rear I/O and rear 120mm fan position are exactly where you'd expect them to be, stuck in the middle. It's worth noting, while we're here, that the rear I/O and the PCI Express slots are depressed. Not in the same way I feel about the cable management situation, rather they're depressed in a recessed fashion from the rear face by a good 15mm. I think this is mainly to reduce the stress on as many of your cables trying to make the turn from your motherboard's rear I/O to utilise the external cable management straps. This works really well for desktops, but I'm not buying it for many other setups like floor mounted ones. The base of the case doesn't have really that much to offer. You've got a massive full-length filter for good reason, unlike that of the Lian Lancool 215s. The feet are massive with well-sized rubber pads, and we've got the side skirts that can be removed along with the feet to ease fan installation. And last but not least, the front panel. It's certainly the centerpiece and it's certainly eye-catching. I really couldn't get enough shots of this punchy design. It's very open with a set of, say this 3 times fast, widely spaced thin fins between the environment and the filter behind, which looks very promising for thermal performance. We've also got this aluminium plate with the new Fractal design wordmark. On the panel removal side of things, we'll start with the main compartment side panel. There aren't any thumb screws, just some ball and socket fixings up top and a few slot and tab features to the base. It works really well thanks to the well-sized grip to the back panel. Very rare these days. However, that can't be said for the other side panel. Sure, it can be removed in the same way, same easily accessible and grabbable top tab bit, but it's replacing it that's a problem. I'll discuss that more in the cable management section later on though. Removing the front panel is very simple. Grab and pull the top. It's much easier than a typical front just pull panel, thanks to the same holding mechanism as the side panels. Looking back to my comments on the lots and lots of plastic, this is where a lot of that comes from. The panel overall is 1.5 inches thick. In fact, I'm going to grab this for... Look how easy that is. It's comprised of 3 separate pieces, including the filter panel, which is a slot and lift pull removal mechanism. The mechanism is alright, it works fine, but it is a little finicky due to all the notches and slots that need aligning and pressing in place. Anyway, the other 2 plastic pieces are intricately molded and aligned interweaving parts. They're screwed together and has less panel flex than most steel side panels. I mean, look at that thing. But it's also a lot of plastic, and maybe I'm just a product of my surroundings, my generation, whatever, but I really hope this thing can be recycled in the future, if not already. And last but by no means least, the top panel. And this one, I really dig. You just pull it backwards and lift it. Like the front panel, this top panel is also an art piece on the inside regarding the fine molding details. It also allows access to the power supply in its section and a massive zone for cable management, including a strap. As a side and front panel, it uses the same kind of post and slot kind of retention mechanism. It's not a clean single-handed removal experience, but what it offers is neat. So there we go. I estimate we're 12 minutes in and we've only covered up to the point where we actually install components. I don't regret that, but let's move on to that quickly anyway. Not so fast. Fan and radiator support first. Up front we've got 2 included 180mm fans. If you get the RGB version, these will be ARGB fans, otherwise we're working with standard 180mm black fans. But they're 4-pin PWM 180mm fans and 35mm thick, which is unusual for most case fans. Now, my experience with these fans hasn't been entirely clean, but I think it's an isolated issue, so I'm going to put my experience of these issues I had towards the end of the video to maintain transparency, but not to derail the overview and critique of this overly long review. I mean, case and its design. It's also quite long-winded. Anyway, outside of the two 180mm fan support up front, we also have some brackets mentioned earlier, which allow the fitting for up to 3 120 or 2 140mm fans and accompanying radiators. This is taking too long as it is, so they exist for that purpose if you need it. There's no fan support up top, just an ARGB lighting strip behind a diffused strip. To the rear, you've got that 120mm fan position, which can also take a 120mm radiator, and it should, because it's a massive space. In the base, you can squeeze in a couple of 180mm fans if you reduce the front to a single 180mm fan, or the other way around, and you've got room for a couple 120 or 140mm fans and respective radiators. That's the fans and radiators covered. Now we can cover the installation process. The power supply unit installation was easier than most other cases due to the power supply unit section being so open, and the position relative to the desk raises it closer to an ideal working height. The power supply unit rests on up to 6 rubber pads that are stuck in place with adhesive, and we're looking at a fan side down cooling configuration since there's no upper intake option. Power supply unit compatibility sits at anywhere from 177mm with the drive bracket closest to the back of the case, and up to 215mm with the drive cage closest to the front or removed entirely. Due to the slope in the chassis, you can still use the space for storing excess cables, but not for the body of the power supply unit itself. But how many power supply units are longer than 215mm? Not many. Also, I highlighted the 215mm spec since I measured it to be that, but Fractal Design states it's 210mm on the website and in the manual. More on that later, although their measurement stuff could be down to 210. Onto the motherboard, and you've got support for up to 274mm wide eATX boards and everything cascading down from that. eATX should probably die as a naming strategy or scheme, since eATX is the same size, especially height-wise, as an ATX board. It's just wider. There's no standard for eATX, as it were. I think ATX Plus or something along those lines makes more sense. For example, you could call it ATX Plus 30 for a board that's 30mm wider than ATX or the ATX standard, right? Anyway, we get a standoff post to align the board while securing it down, but there's not a lot of room for your hands to work around the top of the board with the CPU cooler installed. Well, one the size of the Mugen 5, which is not massive, but it's fairly big. So you will have to make some adjustments to your building sequence, but that's perfectly normal, not a big issue. CPU cooler support is up to 159mm. No, wait, it's 174mm. The truth is, Fractal Design hasn't decided, so they put 174mm on the website and the top of the manual, but thought 159mm was more appropriate for the example air-cooled build in the manual. If you're wondering, it is 174mm. I double-took when I saw the Scythe Mugen 5 when I first read that. I was thinking, what the hell's going on? Loads of space.
Oh god, so I just had a little think about it again and the edit, and it's not even that. It's the whole document is a document of contradictions. So in the air cooling tower build example, which they should put the term example in there, they've got this 159mm CPU cooler height, but then they don't specify the max CPU cooler height, where they do with the GPU length. It's just madness. So it turns out the 159, I'm assuming, is of whatever Fractal Design cooler they happen to have in that example. But then when you go to the CPU cooler limitations, it's the same cooler with then the max limit on it, not the height of that cooler and the why? Why would you do this? And it's the same with everything else. They're talking about 5 2.5-inch drives in the air cooler tower build, but you can't even see the cooler or the drive on the top. You just have to have faith that they put one there. They don't say maximum, they don't say minimum, they only happen to mention that for the GPU length. I have no idea why. Stop doing this. If you're gonna do this and say, oh, the CPU cooler height is 159, tell me what the cooler is, and then tell me the max possible. Or just don't mention the random cooler you happen to think of height. Mention what the max clearance is. Why is this so hard? Just clarity, please.
Onto drives, and we'll start with the top drive bracket since it's our only support for 3.5-inch drive. And also rather interesting in the drive sandwich department. Starting with the 3.5-inch drive, the drive bracket houses grommets that take these long 3.5-inch drive screws, which I only received 3 of. They combine to achieve a vibration dampening solution, but it doesn't end there. You can remove the 3.5-inch drive, take the grommets out, and combine them with these knurled posts to create a friction-mounted 2.5-inch drive position. But it doesn't end there, since they've added these pressed-out offset mounts to provide screw head clearance to achieve the mecca of mounting solutions, the sandwich drive panel. You can also do this with 2 2.5-inch drives on this panel, or 1 2.5-inch and 1 3.5-inch drive. Combine this with the 3 2.5-inch drive sleds to the back of the motherboard tray, and we've got compatibility for up to 1 3.5-inch drives and 3 2.5-inch drives. Sorry, another Fractal design specification issue. In the spec, they state that there are only 3 dedicated 2.5-inch drive positions, when we clearly have 4 here. Sure, the top is a combo position on the top side, but the bottom side is an undisputable dedicated 3.5-inch drive position. You don't need the grommets from the 3.5-inch drive to make it. But again, lower down in the manual, they're recognizing the potential 5 2.5-inch drive position, so I don't know. This stuff should be simple, and it should be correct for the sake of potential buyers, right? Why am I able to pick up on this stuff? It's such low-hanging fruit. Just check, and then publish your documents. Graphics card support sits at roughly 360mm without front fans. With the chunky 35mm deep 180s, you're looking at about 325mm of length clearance, plus or minus 1 or 2mm. It's my measuring after all. And width clearance is just shy of 180mm. The installation was nice and clean, but I'm still not a fan of thumb screws on the PCI Express slots, where standard screws like those used for the power supply unit, they're the same thread pitch and size, would work perfectly fine, or actually even better with the screwdriver you're inevitably using, especially when the holes don't align perfectly and you need to press in harder to get everything aligned. The lack of alignment is just manufacturing tolerance and depends on so many factors, like the holes drilled for the motherboard screw positioning, the bending and forming of all the panels, and even user-induced tolerance for how the board is sitting on the standoffs when you screw them down, which is reduced by the standoff, to be fair, so it's not your fault. And the fact that it requires a fair amount of force to overcome actually speaks well for the rigidity of the chassis as a whole, whereas rear panels in less rigid cases can be flexed into place with just your hands. In that large parts box from earlier, you also get a graphics card support bracket, and it can be connected to one of the 2 slots either side of the lower grommet. What's strange is, in either position, it pretty much ends up with similar limitations. The angled option at its furthest limit supports pretty much the same length of card as the straight option that's closer towards the back. It could support an even longer card, to be fair, and it could also offer a different approach for specific cards or motherboard sizes, which combined with its discrete nature makes it a very welcome addition. Unfortunately, you can't buy extras for those that want multiple cards in their build, at least at the moment. It's a missed opportunity for such a pricey case, just small things like that. It would really help just to be there, optional extras for people who want multiple cards. It'll look weird if you use one and you have 2 cards. Now, I've already moaned about a lot of the cable management issues, and there are a couple more to come, but looking at the positive for just a second, I really like the size of the grommets. We've got this really neat plate that's held off the face of the panel with standoffs that allows smaller cables to be wrapped around it to eat up the excess. I've not seen that in a case before, and it's a very handy concept. The Velcro straps are great, and the one up top with the power supply in it is a nice touch. Just be careful to mind the existing connection for the ARGB lighting strip that's terminating vertically. It will be very easy to put too much force on the cables and press down on that, damaging the connector if you're not careful. Unfortunately, like the last example, there's a direct or indirect, in several instances, downside to all these features. The cable wraparound panel is fine, but if you want to add, say, a super compact ARGB controller like the one supplied with Celentium PC coolers, they have very thin cables and are perfect opportunity to wrap up that excess cable. The little controller box is actually bulky enough to come into the line of fire of the side panel when being replaced, so it needs to flap around a bit to avoid that. And during testing, I needed to access the rear compartment of the motherboard. So often, I just pushed it through the grommet into the main compartment. There's just not enough room in the back. The Velcro straps are great, but the plastic cable combs or guides don't do anything to manage cables, well, don't add anything to managing cables, and they tend to force you to mix and match where the cables go between the guides as they go through them up the case. I found it's better to remove them entirely just by unclipping them from the motherboard tray. Why have chunks of plastic wrapped up in the strap when you can get rid of them and have less going on in the strap? I don't know. The straps are also in a really bad location. The Lancool 215 did this too, which doesn't make sense to me. Like I said in its review, the slip road to the motorway or freeway goes next to the motorway or freeway, not over it, just like off-ramp onto the motorway. It doesn't make any sense. The motorway, onto the motorway, it doesn't make any sense. Having the grommets directly above or below the straps or vice versa, it has the cables elbowing their way past the stream of cables riding over the grommets. I honestly found cable managing this thing to be a pain. With the top power supply in position, you end up with bulky cables running down to the SATA power connectors of your drives and all the way back up. It's just an absolute mess. I could moan about this stuff for a while, and thankfully I just sent the graphics card power connector straight down from the top instead of running it down the back, which requires a long cable. Otherwise, replacing the side panel would be even harder, and I may even have to require 2 Velcro straps to make me feel safer about leaving the case unattended. Seriously, this is the worst cable management solution I've seen as a whole, considering its size, in a very long time, and most of the issues would be relieved with more depth in this compartment. With it being so tight, there really should have been provided some way to secure the panel with a screw. And they did. Right at the top, there's a threaded hole to accept a screw. They only refer to this as a solution for transportation in the back of the manual. This is a must-have for general use. I genuinely don't feel calm around this thing without something to ensure that the panel isn't going to jump off and shatter on the floor. It's good they added something to permanently fix the panel in place, but adding the screw, which I think will be essential in most cases, makes this a non-toolless entry, and also an awkward non-toolless entry. Not a great negative there, sorry, but it's not easy access as it may seem or is made out to be. As for the fans and ARGB element to this case, we have a fan hub to the rear of the case which can take up to 9 PWM fans. You connect the SATA power connector to your power supply unit and connect the 4-pin fan connector to your board, both of those connectors coming from the hub. This allows you or your board to control the PWM signal of all of the fans guided by the state of the fan in the fan 1 position and propagate it to all the others powered by the power supply unit through the hub. It's a fan hub, that's about as complicated as it gets. But something I found when using this hub is it has a lower limiter, as in you can't stop the fan spinning if you wanted to. I think it has a lower limit of 20% duty cycle. This doesn't cause an issue for my testing since I use an NZXT Grid Plus V3. more on that later, which allows me to control the fans however I wish. But using the grid to understand the hub showed me that my CPU fan at 70% when connected to the hub was a good 100 RPM-ish faster than it normally is at a 70% duty cycle. So it appears the lower bound of the hub also impacts the fan curve further up the fan curve. The duty cycle is affected further up the fan curve. You know what I mean. Your maximum fan speed won't change. It will just spin faster at any given duty cycle than it otherwise would. However, this isn't the limit of the issues I faced doing this review. Out of the box, the two 180mm fans weren't controllable. They would spin, but only at 300 RPM each when connected to the grid, and at about 700 RPM when connected to the motherboard. No matter what I tried to do to increase the RPM, which would be normally between 300 and 1200 RPM, I wasn't able to do so. Long story short, I got in touch with Fractal Design Support, explained the problem to them, I had no control, you know what I just said, and they sent over a couple of fans. No, hang on, that's not right again. Right, sorry. They were supposed to send over 2 fans, but only sent 1. They seem to struggle with getting numbers right. Before I move on, Daniel, the guy who was helping me out with this, was great. There just seems to have been an internal issue of communication somewhere along the lines, which means they sent me 1 instead of 2. And I did make sure I said 2. I said both of them were problematic. Anyway, mistakes happen, and no, I haven't told them the whole situation that I'm explaining to you now, since I'm way behind on this review as it is, and need to get it done, and this doesn't really impact anything going forward. I found a way. Anyway, what's weird about this is the new fan doesn't perform any differently. And long story short, these fans only work with my computer's Prime X570 board. They're the only fans that don't work with my grid. Even the 200mm Landcool 215's fans worked fine with the grid. And it's not like it's a current problem since stringing 2 Linearly AL120s at 0.22 amps each work on 1 grid header. These two on 1, that's running at, that's 0.44 amps running on 1 header, as opposed to 0.35 running on 2 individual headers, or 0.35 running on 2 individual headers. So I really don't know. What's going on. And that's well over the 0.35 amp requirement of one of these fans, or the draw of one of these fans, and actually well above the 5 watt limit of the grid's headers. 5 watt, I mean, yeah. So it's not an amperage issue. I generally have no idea what's going on here. But since I was able to control the fan speed of any of these fans with my computer's board, I used that to my benefit. It's just as well I bought a bunch of fan cable extenders ages ago, since I needed to string 9 of them together to connect the fan hub of the Torrent, which I used in this case, which worked totally fine, to my computer. So, yeah. So when I got onto testing, I was actually using the hub with the case, which is not my standard testing setup, but none of this is. FYI, the CPU fan was controlled by the grid as standard. I've not completely lost it. And also, while we're here, I was able to route the exiting cable, goes around the front there, outside of the case and avoid disturbing the filters and the panels, so none of the filters are crooked or the panels are sort of weird. There's actually an undulation in the lower filters frame that allows the cable to fit through perfectly. It's like they knew. Bottom line, I think this is a me problem, not a them problem or a widespread problem, since I found nothing like what I've been experiencing online. So it's not going to affect the score of this case. That wouldn't be fair. This is just an edge case, like a real edge case. I've never come across this before. Every fan's worked with that grid. Every case fan, every other random fan, every CPU cooler fan that I've ever done, it's gone through that grid. So really weird. Touching on the ARGB strip to the power supply unit cover, you'll need to get your own ARGB controller or use a header on your board, especially I think if you're using the non-ARGB version. I'll double check and say here if you need one with the ARGB version. I didn't check that before writing my script. Or you can use the header on your board, which is pretty likely on, you know, lots of motherboards these days. Just be super careful again not to press on the connector inside. It's quite fragile and I don't know why they didn't better protect this or route it differently. As for the manual and parts box, we've gone through the first parts box with the fan brackets and graphics card support bracket. The other parts box, which totally could have been included in the larger parts box, no need for two, contains all the screws you need, minus the 4th hard disk drive screw I was missing, and a cloth to wipe your ass. You also get some zip ties all stored in a pile of single-use plastic bags. I'd like to see these turned into Velcro straps and Ziploc bags, but whatever. It is what it is, and yeah, what am I going to do at this point? As for the manual, I really like this one. It both looks and functions as a book, rarer than you'd think, and it's really interesting to see Fractal Design justify their design with ways to use their case like they designed. If they could just make sure it's all correct, that would be great. Outside of that issue, this one goes well above and beyond to make sure that each connector and where it should go is accounted for. It's hard to complain too much. Now let's finally discuss the performance of this case. We're going to test multiple different setups for this case since there are a few different ways we can use the stock fan in conjunction with an additional fan. The first setup will be the stock setup, so just using the 2 included fans as front intakes. The next setup will be adding the third 180mm fan they sent me as a replacement underneath the graphics card as an intake. I'm curious to see if there's any benefit to the lower intake position. I have done this before and this is why I wanted to double check this sort of thing again, and I want to give this theoretically the best chance it can get that big fan underneath it, full coverage of the card, you know what I mean. And then I want to see if the stock setup, so just the 2 front fans, would drastically benefit from an additional 120mm exhaust to the rear. So all in all, we have 3 setups to test: stock, extra bass intake, and extra rear exhaust. I was gonna do extra bass intake and extra rear exhaust together, but frankly, I spent like 12 hours. What calculated is 12 hours if I did everything back to back and it went perfectly, but there's a lot of slop and error in some of the test runs and stuff, so they had to be cancelled. I had to redo them, so I really didn't fancy spending, say, an extra entire day, which is kind of where, like working day, which is kind of where it goes, to do another setup. So apologies for that, but we got a lot of results, so let's get into the results. So here's the interesting thing. When case fan speed is normalized for noise, at least 37.5 dBA at 40 centimeters from the front corner of the case, as in my testing, the bass intake option performs worse than stock and extra exhaust setups, even on graphics card cooling. It's worth mentioning that fan speed for the CPU cooler and graphics cards fans are locked through all testing at the same speed for everything, so they're not compensating for any case fan changes. The best performer overall is the extra rear exhaust setup. In total, CPU and GPU temps across the Firestrike and Priority 5 with Thermaltake testing, it's about 3 degrees better, which isn't exactly mind-blowing. I mean, 2 different tests, 2 different components in there. Yeah, it's only 3 degrees. So how about full fan speed testing, moving away from normalized ones? Well, it doesn't change the order of the setups regarding performance, so the bass intake didn't make a comeback, but difference between the poor performing 3 180mm fan setup is larger. It's pretty crazy actually. There's only a couple of degrees difference in each component compared to the acoustically normalized testing, where fan speed was between 50 and 60% for all 3 setups. So it's specific, by the way. Here's the graph. But for all of them, they're all between 50 and 60. I'm not just randomly plucking numbers. So ramping them to full speed gets you about 2 degrees more performance for each component in each test. It's so strange. It's not much. Also, the 3 180mm fans were the loudest, which makes sense since they're thicker 1200 RPM 180mm fans, not more typical or standard 25mm thick 800-ish RPM fans, which would likely be quieter and typically are quieter. And what's even more interesting is the Torrent Compact stock setup ranks 3rd in the acoustically limited testing compared to other cases, only just missing out to the H510 Flow. And I know it looks like it's performing better overall than the Flow, but adding up all the temps puts it at 0.8 degrees hotter, So it's basically the same, including CPU temps and, you know, all that. It's basically the same. But it is clearly better on the CPU temperatures at the expense of some GPU temperature. However, turning the fan speed up to full speed with the stock setup, it's top of the list. In total, 7 degrees cooler than the H510 Flow, accounting for both CPU and GPU temps in both tests. So, roughly 3.5 degrees cooler in each test. That's definitely opening up a lot of headroom for the CPU temps, but again, at the expense of the GPU temps or compared to the H510 Flow. It's also worth noting that you can close the gap to the H510 Flow with an extra 120mm rear exhaust in the H510 Flow. So before we get into the final results, I'll quickly say please subscribe to my channel if you want to support the creation of this content. Liking the video and sharing it would be really helpful. It takes a huge amount of my spare time to do this, and unfortunately, believe it or not, this isn't exactly the most popular video to do, and typically speaking, in my opening month of a video, I might earn $1. So, you know, there's expense involved and there's a lot of time involved. But I think it's the most valuable content that I can make, and I really think it's worth, you know, having around. And if you feel the same, I need your support to help me make this work long term. Anyway, that's my bit. That's the kind of ad or, you know, sponsor bit section in most videos. Let's get on to the results. So let's get to the bottom of this quickly. According to my spreadsheet, this is the best case I reviewed. It's actually just second place by 0.04 points to the LAN Cool 215, but I think the inclusion of the graphics card support encourages a bonus quarter of a point. It's not going to get a bonus full point like the O11 Dynamic, it's just going to get a bonus quarter. It's above and beyond as far as I'm concerned. If you think differently and that doesn't deserve a bonus point to you, it ties with the LAN Cool 215 at 9 out of 10. The way I do this in the future may change, so all of these cases may be reduced in score based on how I calculate included case fans, but for now, that's where they stand. Here's a breakdown of how they got their scores, by the way, if you wanted to know. So, and if you really wanted to know the full breakdown of everything, I'm just going to throw that all up here, like installation, ease, build quality, all that sort of stuff. They're all calculated based on tables that are preset, so I'm not just plucking these ideas out of my head at the time. All cases are based on the tables that I have preset for this stuff, based on what I believe to be a good or bad quality.
Hello again, Post AV here. So I just wanted to say that this scoring system is, I think, the best scoring system that I could possibly come up with, because it removes any weird feelings I have about the case. So I break things down into very specific things and compare them to my list of tables, which means if I have some weird opinion about the case, like, oh, there's too much plastic, or oh, the cable management is really bad, it's broken down into a set list of objectives, and I tick what's there and what's not, essentially, and that's what the score is. So even though I personally feel this case has really awful cable management, there's so far that can reduce the score, hence why it's a 9 or 9.25 out of 10, and it's not like a 6, because I feel so horrendously bad about the cable management and the plastics to a certain degree. It's fine, the planet is fine, cable management's a problem though, so just want to say, I think this is the best I can do.
Anyway, let's talk cost. At $150 MSRP, it's the most expensive on the board. So if we do a price per score, essentially dollars per point graph, it's clearly not doing very well. So yes, it is very good at what it does, but it's also very expensive at being very good at what it does. And other options like the Lian Li LAN Cool 215, Cooler Master Masterbox TD500 Mesh, NZXT H510 Flow, and even the Lian Li 11 Dynamic Mini are all better considering price, and they're all around the same size of the Torrent Compact. However, I'd personally recommend looking at the H510 Flow and the LAN Cool 215 as suitable, much cheaper alternatives, despite not maybe looking quite as flashy as this. What more do you need to know?
It has a bracket with a hole in it that can be used for a water cooling fill port that you used as your graphics card power cable, your Scythe.
As with any review, it's more than likely that I've missed some sort of angle. I just have to accept that at some point the video needs to be done. Fun fact, the script for this review is just shy of 6,000 words. A good 900 of those were complaining about, at the start, about cable management and lots of plastic, but I had to get that off my chest. Anyway, I'm getting very dehydrated and hot after doing this under light, so Amazon associate links in the video description if you want to pick this up and help me earn through qualifying purchases. Thanks to my patrons for all your ongoing support. Look forward to a dehydrated exclusive video in your feed shortly after this. Subscribe, like the video, suggestions in the comments, and I'll catch you all in the next one.